take care of a couple things. Welcome, Don.
Thank you so much, Will and Carol and all of the members at Heartland. I'm happy to be here. There's something that I'm supposed to press. Okay, very good. Yes, and I'm very happy to also announce, since you're publicizing my book, the second volume just released, just printed a few weeks ago on the Six Pathways of Happiness, Volume 2 on ethics, compassion, and wisdom in the 21st century. And there is a in section of this text that deals with this topic that I'm talking about today. And all of the proceeds from the purchasing of these books, if you get them from MABA or from myself, the entire amount goes to MABA for fundraising. And if you purchase it from Amazon, 10% goes to the monastery. The rest of it, I think, gets eaten up by the publishers and Amazon. So I want to talk today about the origin of breath counting, and Will is going to help me with the slides. So we'll see if he's successful at being able to get the first slide up, and if not, I can talk without this. No, magic. Thank you. So we can go to the next slide here, and I'm going to talk about this missing link between the original Anapanasati Sutta and the foundation of Zen practice in Japan and also in the United States, and to talk about this new method of meditation on the breath. And the word new will become apparent here very soon. In the next slide, we can see that there is no mention of counting of the breath in the original Buddhist suttas. Mindfulness of the breath was taught mainly in Anapanasati Sutta in 16 parts. There's some aspects of mindfulness of the breath in all of the Satipatthana Sutta, and also its variations as well. But generally, Anapanasati is where you see the term, which means actually mindfulness of breathing. Sati is breathing, is mindfulness, and Anapana is inhalation and exhalation. That's what the words mean. In the next slide, you see that mindfulness of the breath in Anapanasati in 16 parts is subdivided into 4 sections that are called tetrads. This is in the original sutta. And most practitioners, when they say I'm practicing Anapanasati, they're actually only practicing the first tetrad, because the other 3 tetrads require that people have entered at least the second jhana, and excuse me, where all discursive thought, all vitaka and vichara has ceased. That would be quite, advanced practitioner. In the next slide, you see the 16 parts and the different tetrads. And then in the next slide, you see the 16 parts without the labels. And you can see that this is also found not only in the original sutta in Pali, but it's also important in the Agama. The Agama actually is the way it's pronounced in the Chinese text that is the equivalent or attempts to be somewhat parallel to the original suttas, although it's not exactly parallel. So in the next slide, we see that there are 4 formulas that the Buddha uses to begin meditating. In each one of the times where the Buddha is teaching meditation, he gives a kind of a formula to start off with. And the one that is most prevalent is the first one that we use today that begins with ardent, alert, and mindful, putting aside our wants and worries about the daily life. But there are others that are used as well. In one sutta, only the Kaya Gatasati Sutta, has a little bit different, diligent, ardent, and resolute, etc. And then in 7 suttas that are actually for stream enterers that are having a breakthrough, becoming close to awakening, they use a different one: ardent, alert, unified, clear-minded, etc. And then if you're a bhikkhu or an arahat, at a high level, then you use secluded, diligent, ardent, and resolute. And that's in 15 of the suttas. So this is the delineation of the formulas. But for us, really ardent, alert, and mindful, the first one is usually the best one to use, so that when we sit down, we address the cushion and immediately we send our mind to this formula, because we want to concentrate right away. Many people, if they sit down, all of a sudden, all the wants and worries of their daily life start flooding in. So we want to see if we can put our mind in a place where we're not doing that, where we can focus on the breath, for example. So that's the formula that's used to help us to do that. And then in the next slide, you see the actual original formula that continues in Anapanasati in the first tetrad, about breathing in long, or breathing out long, breathing in short, breathing out short, breathing in sensitive to the entire body, or breathing out sensitive to the entire body. There's a bunch of commentaries on what that means, but basically for me, I just pay attention to my body as I inhale and pay attention to it as I exhale. And then the last one is breathing in, calming the bodily fabrication or bodily formation, which is really the breathing itself, the inhale and the exhale. That's the bodily formation. So, and I have it here both in the English, and in case you really want to be diligent, you can learn the Pali, I guess. Okay. So the Anapanasati, in the next slide, you see this is just the summary of the breathing in long and short, and then the entire body and calming the bodily formation. Okay, so then the next slide. If there's no mention of breath counting in the Nikaya, all of the collection of the suttas, then how did breath counting come to be? And so we're going to start with what we know, where this method was practiced, and work backwards in time towards its origin. So in the next slide, we can see that there was this Zen master, his name Kaizan, who lived in the 13th, 14th century. He was the 4th generation Dharma heir of Dogen in the 13th century, and in the Soto school. And he was the one who really taught breath counting. Now, I'm talking at a Zen center, so I'm assuming that you've already read some Dogen and maybe some Kaizan, so you're probably familiar with some of these teachers in Japan. My sources tell me that Dogen himself was not a big fan of counting, and he would start meditation with following the breath, the inhale and exhale. And it was Master Kaizan who really was the person who was enthusiastic about counting. But I'm not an expert in this particular area, but this is just something that I have seen in some of my research. But I don't have it corroborated enough to say for sure. But now nearly all of the Japanese schools have breath counting as a foundational practice. You go to many Zen centers, and if they're teaching you meditation, they're going to begin with the counting. So where would Kaizan, or particularly Dogen, where would he have learned this technique to bring to Japan? So in the next slide, we see that there was this great master, his name Zhi, of the Tiantai school, Tiantai Mountain. And so he used the same 6 methods of breathing in the 6 sublime Dharma gates we call Liu Miao Fa Man. I apologize, I don't have any of the Japanese translations of this. I'm from a Chinese monastery, so I'm kind of challenged even to learn the Chinese. So the 6 sublime Dharma gates is a very important text of this terrifically important master Zhi, and who was also claimed not only as a lineage master of the Tiantai school, but also he's also considered very important in the Chan or Zen school as well. So he kind of crosses from one school to the next, as many did at this particular time. In the next slide, you see that where this technique was also practiced in the 6th century was by Buddhaghosa. He included the 6 methods with some variation in terminology in his text called the Path of Purification, the Visuddhimagga. This is the foundational Theravadan text. I have a copy of it here somewhere, if I can grab it. It's not a very, it's a kind of a thin text here, not too substantial. I don't know if you can, maybe we can't get it online. It has like probably 800 pages or something. It's huge with small print. Maybe later I'll bring it out. Yes. But this Path of Purification also available for free, by the way, both online and through the publisher. So no charge for this. You can just do it by donation. Now in the next slide, you can see, let's see, okay, we want to go to the next slide. The next slide is where we go back a little bit further to the year 401, when Kumarajiva, the great translator, translated a text called the Sutra on the Concentration of Sitting Meditation, the Zhao Chan Sanmei Jing. And this text, Sanmei means it looks like 3 characteristics, but actually it means samadhi. That's the term. Sanmei is the term that's used for samadhi because it kind of sounds like samadhi. Yes. And so this particular text, Chan, of course, is the word for Zen, same character. Yes. So this sutra, Jing is sutra. So this is sitting meditation. So this was translated by Kumarajiva, and it also contains the 6 methods as well. Now, going back a little bit further into the 4th century, into the 300s now, we come to Vasubandhu, who was one of the founders of the Yogacara branch, along with his brother, Asanga. This is a very important transition from the Sarvastivadin school to the Sautrantika school to the Yogacara school. This all happened during the time of Vasubandhu in India, in northern India, and it includes also the 6 methods of breathing in the Abhidhamma Kosha Bhaskya. So this, again, we can see that these methods existed in all of these forms. But now if we want to actually now go to the next slide, we see where is the origin? Where did they get all of this from? It turns out that they got this from a text called the Anban Shouyi Jing, or the Sutra on Mindfulness of Inhalation and Exhalation. And to the next slide, we see that this was translated by An Shigao, who is one of the early great translators of texts from Sanskrit into Chinese. Now we're in the 2nd century. And his translation of this text, I'm going to talk a lot about it a little bit, was in that time considered a commentary on Anapanasati, on the original text of the Buddha. Now, we don't have the original Sanskrit version anymore. We only have the Chinese. So if we go to the next slide, we see that there are two main versions of this text that are in existence. The first version is found in the Taisho. This is the listing of the text in Chinese, and it's called the Da Anban Shoyi. Da means great. Anban is inhalation, exhalation. Shoyi is a term that was used to relate to the mind or mindfulness. That this is early in the Han Dynasty, and the Jing, of course, is the text. So this particular version contains many lines of commentary that were written into the text. So we don't know what's the text originally and what's the commentary. It's all mishmashed together. Fortunately, a second version was found in a Japanese monastery in 1999 CE, just 20 some odd years ago. And it is known as the Anban Shoyi Jing, the Kongo version, or the KABSYJ. So this version was clean. It didn't have any commentary in it at all. And that's why I can call this the new method, because now we know what the original method was. The only problem is that it was written in Han Dynasty Chinese. Oh, what a struggle that is. So many of the terms that were used at that time are different than the terms that were even used in the Tang Dynasty. My interest is, at this point in my life, focused on trying to understand how to translate some of the Tang Dynasty texts that haven't been translated, or at least sections of them. So when I get involved in looking at the original Han Dynasty Chinese, I can get very confused. To give you an example, there's in one of the lines of this particular text in Chinese, they use repeatedly, I think it's in the fourth method of observing, they use repeatedly the word wu yin, wu yin, wu yin, yin like yin and yang, wu like five. So it's five yin and yin, five darknesses, five females. One of the translations that I put it in, it said five vaginas. I said, oh, this can't be right. There's something wrong here. So I had to go back into resources and dictionaries and look more deeply. And actually, I found out that in the Han Dynasty, they used the word yin for yun, which means aggregates. So it means the five aggregates. And as soon as I saw, oh, that's what it meant, then the whole verse became much clearer. So you can see some of the difficulties that happen when you're trying to do some of this early translation. The terms are just very, very confusing. I just ran into another one in the Sutra for Humane Kings that was very confusing, and it wasn't until I was able to unravel some of the meaning that it began to make sense. So in the next slide, you see here are the 6 methods. So one method, we talked about counting. This is the first method that we were doing in our practice this morning, where you say the number 1, either on the inhale or on the exhale, or sometimes you can do it, if you're just beginning, you can do it 1 on the inhale, 2 on the exhale, then you get to 10 faster. So the mind doesn't have to stay focused for so long. And then eventually maybe you graduate to just saying the number 1 on the exhale, and you go to 10, and then you begin again. And for many people in the tradition, that's what they're doing. They're focusing on the breath. But as I said, Dogen was, according to my resources, not so interested in this. And his interest was actually to start with the following practice. Now, let me just say another word about counting, and that is that there were methods of counting that were used in some of the original Mahayana sutras before we were talking about these 6 methods. So, for example, in the Sarvastivadin school, and something that was used by Vasubandhu as well, back in the 4th century, was a method of a 4-part method of arising, abiding, changing, and ceasing. So each breath, instead of counting the entire breath, you would just go through these 4 parts. Arising is the inhale, the abiding is the short pause at the top, the exhale is the changing. Actually, the word really means exchanging. And then the word for ceasing, this is a cessation, yeah. So you can do this in your thought process. And if you want to get rid of the conceptualization, it's easy. You can do it in Chinese. You can say shang zhu yi mie. And that way you don't have to worry about the words, and you can just follow along. This technique is also discussed in the Sarangama Sutra and so probably some other places as well. But in any event, counting has been something that has been utilized as a method of keeping the mind focused on the breath. And then in the following section, you kind of allow the mind to wander some, but then you try to begin to catch it and bring it back to the breath. But without a lot of effort, you just allow that to happen. In the stopping part, that's where we use our diligence to try to bring the mind into clarity and see if you can get the mind to stop all of the chattering internally, the papancha, as we say in Pali, the proliferation of thought. Now, I could go into a little bit more detail about the 3 types of thought that get discussed in particularly the Yogacara school, about how there's one kind of thought, which we call discriminative thought. You walk into a room and you see a chair and a table, and you are aware, oh, I'm going to sit in the chair, not on the table. Although I have a patient who wanted to sit on my table the other day. I said, no, not necessary. So sitting on the chair, you discriminate when you're driving down the road. You use discrimination. You know the difference between the road and the tree, and the road and other cars. You discriminate one object from another. This is part of the 6 senses of the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and then the mind itself is a discriminative sense. Then in the next level of consciousness, we call 7th consciousness, this is the awareness that we create about a self. So we have this self-referential thinking. We turn this body and mind into its own object. And this is where many troubles can begin, because then we start taking things personally, and we want to extend our life permanently, and we want to think of ourselves as perfect, and this creates all kinds of difficulties. So these 2 particular parts of thinking, when we're meditating, we don't need to be concerned about the difference between trees and the road, because we're just sitting or standing. We're not going anywhere. If we're doing walking meditation, just a little bit of discrimination is needed. But the part of the mind that's chattering away, we become aware, oh, that's my self-referential mind. That's what we call the discursive mind. And that's the part of the mind that we want to quiet down, calm down, and eventually don't need that so much. The third part of the mind thinking is called discernment. This is the wisdom of the mind. This is when the mind has reached a certain level of understanding how to apply the principles. That's a topic for another day. But that's what we call wisdom or discernment. That part of the mind continues to operate. So we don't stop that. If we stop that, then we don't have any Dharma teachers. We don't have the Buddha's not talking. Those kinds of things, because the mind has stopped completely, and we don't need that kind of operation to stop. So then we go to the next level, which is called observing. In the next slide, I go into a little bit more detail. In the observing, then the mind focuses on an object. And here the object in this particular meditation are the 5 aggregates. So this is a little bit tricky because the next levels after that are just a deeper refinement of this observing, and would require another several hours of discussion. So during the meditation, I like to just observe the gross parts of the aggregates first, the aggregate of the body and feeling and thought. Those are the rough parts, not as subtle as when we go into the volitional formations, which are the body, the verbal, and the mind. And then you can return to that and go deeper until you finally begin to start clarifying and purifying the consciousness itself. So that's a little bit about the method that we just went through. Okay, so let's look again at going to the next slide. We can see that in the text itself, in the 6 methods of breathing, the Anban Shouyi Jing, the more recent version, we can see that there is a connection that is made between the 6 parts and the 6 parts of the 37 prerequisites for the attainment of enlightenment that are found in the original suttas. So if you're familiar with the 37 prerequisites, which include the 4 foundations of mindfulness, that's mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of feeling, mindfulness of mind, and mindfulness of phenomenon, then you can go call the 4 right efforts, which is restraining the mind from doing harm, and using that as a foundation to understand how to go deeper and uproot what it is that's harmful, and then to cultivate what is wholesome and to maintain what is wholesome. These are called the 4 right efforts, etc. There are these different roads to this energy or strength, faculties and different energies and powers that the mind begins to attain. And then, of course, the famous teachings on the 7 factors of awakening, which you find throughout the suttas, which start with mindfulness and end with equanimity. And of course, the Eightfold Path, which begins with the right effort and all the way up to right concentration. So these are the factors that are associated, and the text itself explains this in Han Dynasty Chinese. So if you have good facility, you can do that one. There is a rough translation that's done by a disciple of Master Sheng Yen, but it's in and of itself is a little bit tricky as well, but I can give the resource for that if people are interested. And the next slide is kind of just a visual picture of the 37 factors and the different methods. If we go to the next slide, you can see there you go. We have the different, I have a visual of that for people who are more visual in their, they like to have boxes and charts and maps and things like that. I'm kind of like that myself. And you can see that observing crosses over. Yeah. Okay, so the next slide, I just want to go back and just give a little bit more reference. The counting of the breath. This is the 4 ways to abandon thought, is sometimes is called this as well. And this is the reference perhaps to the 4 foundations of mindfulness. And in the next slide, you can see that this counting method refers to the saying of one number all the way up to 10, etc., that we've talked about. In the next slide, we have Buddhaghosa. So here I'm giving the actual citation from the text of Visuddhimagga. Here in counting is just counting. Connection is what he calls the next one, is carrying on. Touching is the placing touch by the breath, and fixing is an absorption. Observing is insight. Turning away is the path, and purification is the fruition, leading back. So you can see in the next slide, I have it outlined here. So this, you can actually go into the Visuddhimagga and you can find this section where he talks about the importance of counting all the way up through purification and looking back. You see how similar this is to the Anshiga method. Now, this is here in the 6th century. Now, you go to the Vasubandhu in the next slide, and you can see that Vasubandhu has the same 6 operations: counting, following, fixing, observing, modifying, and purifying. So he uses the word modifying instead of returning. And again, the citation in the Abhidharmakosha Shastra, you can see these aspects that are delineated right there in the text. If you go to, in the next one, this is the actual translation of the text. Fortunately, this has been done for us. Counting, one fixes the mind on the in-breathing and out-breathing without effort or contention. One lets the body and mind be as they are, and one counts from 1 to 10 only in the mind. One does not count to less than 10 nor more than 10 for fear of contention and of mental distraction. So, as you can see, Vasubandhu specifically talks about breath counting here. If we go to the next one, we have the great master Zhi. I have lots of respect for him. He's someone who I have started to study when I was in undergrad school back in the 60s. And I'm just continually impressed by the depth of his understanding and his ability to teach. The Tendite school really focuses a lot on many different aspects of Buddhism, using many of the most important sutras. And for him, the Lotus Sutra and the Nirvana Sutra are the most important, but he goes through many of the other ones as well in great detail. And it's very possible that Dogen would have been influenced by Master Zhi because he was so well known during the same time that Dogen was there. Although Dogen was studying in the Chan school, he would have easily become in contact with Master Zhi's works. And his text, the 6 sublime Dharma gates, sometimes called the 6 mysterious Dharma gates, but I don't like the word mysterious so much because Buddhism is not mysterious. And sometimes it says marvelous Dharma gates, but again, wouldn't want to flatter yourself that way. So sublime is a better translation for the word. So in the next slide, we can see a comparison between the Dan Ban Shu Yi Jing of Anshigao and the 6 sublime Dharma gates of Master Zhi. And you can see that he uses the identical Chinese words. He just adds the word mun, which means gate. And of course, all of you there are good Zen students, and you know about the gateless gate. And the gungan or the koans that are found within that particular text by I think you call them, I'm trying to remember the Japanese, but in Chinese, the great master, the no-gate master, Wuman. And so his, I think the Muman Kan, I think is how you call it in the Japanese. But this terminology of gates is quite important because it has to do with the fact that if you have a wall that you're trying to get through, and this is something that's discussed, for example, in the Visuddhimagga and in other places, going all the way back to a sutra that in the original sutta that the Buddha spoke about, called the fortress, where he talks about the wall and how everything is analogous to being able to understand how the mind is like a fortress. And you need to have a gate in and out. Of course, in China, they had the Great Wall. And so the mind was like this kind of essence that required the ability to be able to go in and out. We have the 6 gates that have to do with our senses, for example. The eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. But here he's talking about the more subtle aspects of the mind gates and how to gain access to them. Curiously enough, the word for gate mun is also associated with another word which means a barrier, guan. So this guan barrier is also necessary when you have a gate, because if you don't have a way of protecting the gate, then the negative forces can come in and just rush through the gate and break through the gate, and then you have a big problem. And maybe you saw the news reports about some construction workers that were working on the Great Wall, and they just decided to make their own break in the gate. They made it their own gate so they could more easily drive through the wall from one side to the other, and they all got arrested for doing that. That's not a good idea. But there were special barriers that were put up on the inside of the wall so that when people would try to break through the wall, they wouldn't know which way to go. There were all kind of like a little bit of a maze that would happen. And if they didn't know the correct way through, then they would end up in a trap and crossfire and be destroyed. So there are these different kinds of gates. So because if you just have one kind of gate, then it's easy, on one kind of barrier, then it's easy for the opposing forces to find their way in. So there were 3 types of gates that were used. One called the face-to-face gate, another one called the mountain and sea gate, and the third called the wild goose gate. And the gungan or the koans would fall into these kinds of gates, depending upon whether it was an easy gate, like the face-to-face gate, which had 3 or 4 gungan or koans that were very famous, like the sound of one hand clapping, show me your original face, does a dog have Buddha nature, woo or moo? Those are the face-to-face kind of gate koans. So anyway, so all of this kind of stuff was well known during this time. So the term gate was a very familiar term to the Chinese that were practicing. In the next slide, you can see that Master Zhi has his own commentary. And when you get to the contemplation in step 4 of the specific object, this was the aggregates, and then being able to perceive one's mind is unreal. This is the awareness of particularly the aggregates, the aggregate of mental formations. This is what gives us a sense of reality about that we have this real self. And there's no basis for this. There's an illusion that's created. The illusion is the consciousness itself. If you read the original sutta, called the foam, he goes and gives metaphors for each of the aggregates, and when he gets to consciousness, it's like a magic trick. Yeah, an illusion. So the next slide of Kumara Jiva is concentration is sitting meditation. And then in the next slide, you can see he also has the same kind of breakdown. He doesn't talk so much about purification. He talks about how there are cures for each one of the afflictions that come with the method. So, for example, if you have a lot of trouble with discursive thought, then counting is a good method. Focus on the inhalation and exhalation. If you have trouble with lusting after things, I want more and more of something, then you focus on particularly sexual lust would be a particular problem. Then you focus on the impurity of the body, how the body ages and has all of you take the skin off, not so pleasant. And then, so this is when a person has anger, this is where you want to use stopping and replace that with loving kindness and compassion. And when you do observing, this is when you try to overcome the ignorance that we have of particularly of the Four Noble Truths, the 12 links of dependent origination. So this is where we use contemplation, where we focus on certain principles to try to help us to overcome our ignorance. And if we have multiple problems, then we continue to come back over and over again and single-mindedly recall the Buddha's name is what he uses here in this particular text, because this eventually was picked up a lot by the Pure Land group as well. So the next slide is kind of a review. And I just want to kind of stop here because I could go on. There's many other layers and levels to the Anban Shuyi Jing, and I think it's good. This is a good time for me to kind of conclude my talk and then to be able to take people's questions or comments, criticisms, to be able to say,